Welcome to the CTA podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA podcast with your hosts, Jacques van Zyl and Christine Siefen.
Welcome, everybody. Christine and I are delighted to have you as our guest today at the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast. We're also delighted because we have a very interesting guest today. You'll be familiar with our guest. It is Dr. Bret Alderman. Bret Alderman is a life coach and a writer. He graduated from the Pacifica Graduate Institute in 2013, where he got his PhD, where he studied depth psychology. His previous volume is entitled Symptom, Symbol, and the Other of Language, a Jungian interpretation of the Linguistic Turn in 2016. Just before our episode started, we said, Bret has a knack of taking on the difficult stuff. And he also has a knack of really explaining it in very accessible terms. And we really, really enjoyed also the book we're going to discuss today. And this is your latest, fresh off the print, and that is Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction, an archetypal reading of Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler. Bret, welcome, and man, congratulations on a great product.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And yeah, I'm so happy to be speaking with both of you.
We're happy to have you. Maybe we could start with you just telling us a bit about your inspiration to write this latest book that you've written. What has inspired you to delve right in deep? And
I hope it wasn't ayahuasca. I hope it wasn't ayahuasca or some illegal drug.
I have yet to try ayahuasca. Actually, this book started as a discarded chapter from my first book, where I was trying to look at like different mythic parallels that I could draw between, broadly speaking, sort of postmodernism or that linguistic turn approach that I was talking about. And I wanted to come up with like, you know, what are the parallels in myth? And for the first book, I really focused on the parallel between Prometheus, you know, that figure who steals fire from the gods, and these sort of deconstructive postmodernists. But then I also had a couple other figures in mind, and one was a figure of the eternal youth, which is a bit like a Peter Pan figure, or the figure of Icarus, who flies too close to the sun and his wings melt and he falls back down to the earth. And I kind of got started on that chapter, and I could really see some parallels between, you know, deconstruction and the writings of Jacques Derrida and these mythic figures, but it just kind of didn't make it into the book. And so I thought I'd write a chapter for or an essay for a journal. And the thing just kept growing and growing and growing. And at some point, about halfway through, I just thought, oh, damn, this is a friggin' book and I have to do it.
Right. So let's jump into it. Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction, an archetypal reading of Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler. What is deconstruction?
So this is the one quote that I will read for this entire interview, but it's literally one sentence. And I think the one sentence really epitomizes deconstruction in a way that will be clear for people who are not familiar with that particular form of thought. And the quote comes from Derrida's book, Dissemination, And it's actually from Barbara Johnson, who wrote the introduction to that book. And what she says is this. She says that deconstruction reads backwards from what seems natural, obvious, self-evident, or universal in order to show that these things have their history, their reasons for being the way they are, their effects on what follows from them, and that the starting point is not a natural given, but a cultural construct, usually blind to itself. And I think that is a really, really good, super, super condensed sort of definition, working definition of kind of the ethos of deconstruction, which is a kind of a mindset that says, well, what you thought was just obvious, just kind of self-evident, just sort of given by the nature of things. Well, actually, it isn't. It's not natural. It's cultural, or it's not. It's a question of language. It's not a question of just the way things just are, right? So, deconstruction is always kind of privileging language and culture over things like perception and nature, which has some really, really profound effects on everything that follows from it.
Well, profound effects and problems of their own.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. It's a kind of a, when you read, for example, that quote kind of in the abstract, you can kind of see how, well, that's interesting. But if you follow through on that line of thinking, sort of, to its absurd extremes, I think you get a lot of the ideas that are really, really taking hold of us right now, even in the popular culture, particularly in the area of gender and its deconstruction, which originally was not going to be a part of the book, but just as it kept kind of erupting in the culture, I thought, well, I can see the parallels, so I might as well write about, how deconstruction is actually affecting how everyday people are thinking about things, even as fundamental as gender.
And that's where Judith Butler comes in.
That's where Judith Butler comes in. And Judith Butler was not originally going to be a part of this book. And usually people don't necessarily associate her with Jacques Derrida. The first name that will come out of people's mouth is Michel Foucault, which is warranted, and that makes sense. But at the same time, if you go back to some of her first most influential works, like Bodies That Matter, you can see that, what she calls her critique of what she calls a metaphysics of substance is almost a copy of Derrida's critique of a metaphysics of presence. What I'm trying to say is that she was much more deeply influenced by deconstruction than I think is often acknowledged. Yeah.
Right. Deconstruction of substance and deconstruction of presence. So we have the material, maternal, already there, and presence, the temporal, father time, already there. But let's not spill the beans yet. Okay. Now, I like this one piece in your book, and I wrote here, quote. Okay, so let me quote it. Let me read it. It is a mindset that seeks to erode tradition in the name of the new, to undermine norms or normativities, with the often unspoken assumption that doing so is a liberating endeavor. In a quest to dismantle all prejudices and reveal their corruption, there's the moral inclination, the so-called moral inclination. It points out the apparent arbitrariness and even insidiousness of conventional beliefs. This dispeller of illusion, the spirit of deconstruction, exists well beyond the texts or techniques that bear its name. You can hear its echo in every assertion that something seemingly self-evident is, in fact, just a social construct, something quite flimsy and ephemeral, not as substantial or real as one had previously thought. Deconstruction as perennial type matters precisely because it is so present, so contemporary, yet so perennial.
Mm-hmm.
It is both current and recurrent. Yes, Janine Chassagues-Mergel says the same.
Mm.
This suggests that it springs from a readiness to produce over and again the same or similar ideas as those that have been produced in ages prior. And what you just described is a very radical historicizing,
Mm-hmm.
very radical relativizing of language, of what we accept as real.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think it is, in its essence, an attitude that has been around for a long, long time. I mean, in a way, a lot of what I see in deconstruction is that sort of youthful impulse to say, what you authorities say, what tradition says, what mom and dad says, that's a bunch of crap. I know better. And it kind of conceives of everything that could fall under the category of tradition or authority or even parents. It conceives of all of that as being sort of oppressive, reductive, confining, but in a reflexive, non-thoughtful sort of way. And I think that's the important thing, because, I mean, on the one hand, it is important to be able to look back at tradition and history and look at the ideas that we've inherited and sort of question them and say, well, is that true? But I think there's something in the nature of deconstruction where it just assumes that what came before is illusory, delusional, prejudicial, oppressive. It automatically gives it a negative value, which is, as soon as you're thinking in that mindset, I mean, you're kind of already captured by a narrative. You're captured by a particular way of thinking and unable to break out of it.
I think that is valuable. It is not just a curiosity to see how certain concepts may have evolved, because that would be a very ambivalent, just like I said, just a curious stance. But it is important that that aspect, it comes from, again, from a different register. It's a register of resentment.
Right.
That our cultures, our culture, our language, where we find ourselves is depriving us of something we're entitled to. And because of that, it is oppressive.
Right.
And because of that, it needs to be deconstructed and dismantled.
Right. Right.
And that is within that register that they do the deconstruction as an operation.
Yeah. It rarely asks, okay, what have we inherited from the past that is of immense value? Or what are we already using from that tradition that we're maligning?
I wanted to go back to just to stay with that for a minute, because I know that, you mentioned the importance of the past, and there's some benefit to deconstructing the past in some way, so that we can not repeat mistakes, etc., learn from where we've been, where we're going. But where does that cross the line? Because there's a line in the sand there with that. And I don't know if this is an answerable question, but I think it's something that comes up for me is there's value in it, but then it crosses a line. And where does that line in the sand get drawn? Because on the other side of that line is where we have become dismantled as a functioning society in many ways.
Yeah. And I think you're right to, ask that question. Where is the line? Where is the stopping point? And that's, it's part of the nature of this myth of eternal youth. to say that there should be no limits, there should be no line, almost on principle. And that's kind of why I like to bring in the myth of Icarus, because that's a wonderful story that a lot of people know of. There's Icarus and Daedalus, his dad, and they forge these wings, and they're going to fly to escape an island. And father says to son, don't fly too close to the sun. Okay, basically saying there's some limits to this. You can fly, but within certain parameters.
In the middle.
And Icarus, in his youthful folly, doesn't heed his father, doesn't heed limits, flies too close to the sun, falls to the earth, and dies a tragic death. And I think that's a great mythic expression of what you're referring to, Christine, is like, okay, the flying is fine, the deconstructing is fine, but up to what point? And, to put maybe a finer point on this, it's like, you could say, well, gravity is a social construct. And in some sense it is. I mean, the word gravity, we came up with it to refer to these certain phenomena that we see and perceive. And, other languages might not use that exact word, or they might have different ways of thinking about things. And yet, if we just leave it at that, we kind of not facing the fact that, well, I mean, that's real. I mean, if you lose your balance, you actually do fall on your face. And if I let go of a pen, it actually does drop. And that word gravity refers to something in the real world that cannot be reduced to like some arbitrary construction, right? And I think what you're asking, Christine, is like, okay, it's like, when does it go too far? And I think it goes too far if somebody's saying, well, little did you know, gravity is just a social construct, or, little did you know that, psychological pain is just it's something that a certain discipline called psychology created, but it doesn't have any real existence beyond that sort of thing that we invented.
Goes against the nature of, I love that you said that. I listened to your CTA talk multiple times. I wasn't able to attend. Yeah. And it was very eye-opening, and something that you said that came up multiple times, and I think is a very good way to understand this, is that when it goes too far, it sort of dismisses the nature of things, the natural order of things, the natural order of the world, and how when some hot and cold, I mean, I think you gave some good examples of hot and cold, or weight and lightness, up and down, things that actually do have a pretty significant boundary and a limit and a containment.
Right.
And when we're missing the natural nature and order of things, which we tend to be missing now, which is why we're here today, that's when it's gone awry, in a sense.
Yeah.
Consensus reality, in other words. Yeah.
Right. Consensus reality, the reality that we all share, that sort of limits us in time and space. And it's also a material reality. So, I mean, and, there's as a Jungian, I do believe that the psyche is real, that we can talk about the reality of fantasy, for example, or the reality of dreams. However, there's also, this sort of consensus reality of time and space that, we have to continually come back to, to ground ourselves, to ground our language, to ground our relationships, and to acknowledge things like shared experience, the world that we all live in. Yeah.
But just as a meta-analysis, though, just thinking around what we're doing. We as psychologists, psychotherapists, we know what we're doing. We're applying myth to what we're observing now. You're a Jungian. What is, just explain this methodology, just for the sake of those who are not familiar with subjecting phenomena to archetypal or mythical analysis. What is this? What is this about?
Okay, so I want to give an apology to begin with, because I'm going to talk Freud and be really, really reductive in a way that, people will say, well, that's not quite fair. But, you know, popularly speaking, I mean, everybody, a lot of people understand what an Oedipus complex is, right?
Mhm.
And that was something that Freud, that's an example of where Freud used a myth, and he talked about how that sort of metaphorically expresses what some people go through, particularly men. He had the Electra complex for women. And, Jung comes along and he says, well, that's brilliant, but I think we can do the same thing with all myths.
Yes.
And that's kind of, I think, one of his first big breaks with Freud. And then Jung does something that's really, I think, extremely innovative that I love. And he takes it even a step farther, and he says, we can draw mythic parallels, not just between, what we see in the consulting room and, what we're seeing in mythology. We can also draw parallels between thought systems that are like alchemy and myth, or alchemy and what people are living in the consulting room. And so he had this great, had this great sort of associative logic where he could draw parallels. And there are Jungians who've kind of ran with that, and they will do sort of mythic readings of broad cultural phenomena, or mythic readings, in my case, of particular thought systems. So I wanted to look at this thought system called deconstruction and say, okay, what if that's a myth? What kind of a myth is it?
Yes. So myths are these supraordinate narratives that incarnate in many things within the human realm, in individuals, in epochs, in fields of study, in areas of philosophy. So everything is in some way an incarnation, if I can use that very loaded word, of these supraordinate archetypes, constellations, how these archetypes are being constellated within the human realm, right? Yeah. And that is what a Jungian analysis of phenomena looks like. Yeah,
you said that very well. And I think supraordinate is a good word to keep in mind. And it's, one of Jung's definitions of archetype that I keep coming back to is he talks about it as the potential for representation. So, I mean, what does that mean? Well, so if you think of the mother archetype, well, a really superficial understanding of Jung might say, well, oh, mother archetype, well, oh, that's like the Virgin Mary, or that's like, the image, just an image of mother. And Jung's kind of saying something different. He says, no, the archetype is just our ability to come up with mother images. It's like to represent this ineffable thing called mother, right? And for Jung, we're sort of born with this ability to sort of come up with particular stories and images that are going to fit these fundamental life situations. Like you might think of, the archetype of the nemesis, which is like the archetype of the enemy.
Yes.
Right.
And if you just think of it evolutionarily, it would make sense that human animals would benefit from kind of having a predisposition to imagining something that they would call an enemy, something that they have to be careful of, attack, defend against. This is sort of, and so, Jung would say, well, that's part of the archetype of the enemy, or this sort of archetypal fundamental human pattern, way of thinking about things, way of behaving in the world, and also way of, imagining and representing fundamental human situations. No, that's a mouthful, but I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then in this case, you're focusing very much on the puer eternus, or the puella eterna, the eternal youth.
Right. So I think one of the images of the eternal youth that might resonate most with a lot of people is the image of Peter Pan.
Yes.
Now, Peter Pan will be 9 years old forever. Okay. He's the boy who never grows up, and he lives in a place called Neverland. So Neverland, as the name suggests, is a place where time doesn't pass, or it doesn't pass in the same way that it does, let's say, in consensus reality. And so, I mean, this is a figure of a youth that doesn't evolve, doesn't mature. He's in a place of stasis. And so, I mean, Jungians often use a story like Peter Pan to talk about individuals, you know, the Peter Pan personality. I think that was a common idea 20, 30 years ago. There was a Peter Pan syndrome, and people were talking about this. It's kind of like a person who stays in a very youthful attitude, but for way too long. You know, I think one of the things that helps me think about eternal youth is just two words. It's the words "not yet." And if someone's is kind of possessed of this myth of the eternal youth, if they have a Peter Pan complex, they're always saying "not yet." You know, I am going to be the great American novelist of the 21st century, and I'm going to start my novel tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes and I say, well, not quite yet. But tomorrow I'm going to start. And then it's always this postponement, this putting off. It's like this chronic way of putting off actually entering into the present moment and actually doing the thing. So there's a puer personalities, or eternal youth personalities, tend to be people who say, well, I'm not yet in the place that I need to be. I'm not yet in real life. Someday I will be, but not quite yet. There's a way that I think Derrida and Butler and deconstruction kind of do the same thing.
Okay.
And this is where I hope I don't get too deep into the woods of these really difficult thinkers, but really at the heart of deconstruction, as Derrida talks about it, is this word that he came up with, and it's defiance. And it's a neologism. It's a word he came up with that's a combination of two different words in French, basically the word for deferral and the word for differentiate.
Right.
And so, you know, when I saw that and I saw deferral, putting something off, having it not yet happen, I thought, oh, well, that's what the eternal youth does.
Yes.
Now, Derrida does this in this really, I will say, original, complicated, difficult way. But what his argument, he argues, well, words don't ever really get to what they're trying to get to. They never really get to what they mean. So meaning is never really present. It's not yet here. So he developed a way of reading texts where you could look at a text and say, all of the meaning that you think it's communicating is actually not quite present. There's always going to be something left out. It's always going to be incomplete. And so we can't yet really say what this text fully means. yeah, I don't, maybe I kind of want to pause here
Yes.
and
Right, good.
does that make sense? And how should I flesh
Absolutely.
that out?
So when he does that, where does he leave the reader at?
Well, I think he kind of leaves the reader nowhere. And
Suspended.
suspended. And I think the word nowhere and no place are good to keep in mind, because that's the meaning of the word utopia. And utopia is also a major theme
Yes.
in stories of the eternal youth, because
Yes.
that land that the eternal youth is always dreaming of, that exists somewhere in the future, that is not yet to be encountered, it's utopia. It's, you know, when things are ideal. And so there's that theme of the elsewhere, the not yet, the realm that's far off, that maybe we can get to at some point, but we're not yet there. So, but I want to kind of answer that, what you just asked me, in another way, is to say that, well, he leaves you nowhere, because he leaves you in a place where it's like you're looking at language, but there's no way of kind of bringing it back to the present moment and saying, how do words, I mean, what do these words mean that I'm reading right here and right now? Because it's always this assumption that we can never get to that. There's no there.
Yeah, I think that's what my question is there never really is a there. So what's the payoff in all of this?
Well, if you think that the entirety of Western thought has been oppressive and reductive and mistaken and violent, which is a term that
Yes.
Derrida uses quite a bit, then dismantling it is a good in and of itself. You know, I was really struck when I started going deeper into this line of thinking and reading a lot of the original texts, how Derrida really did conceive of his project of deconstruction as a way of taking apart all of Western philosophy, all of the sciences, all of the social sciences, all of the humanities, like all of the sense-making apparatus of the entire Western civilization. He comes along and he says, actually, it's all mistaken. Every last little bit of it. And he does have that tendency to conceive of all of it as being side of the, he talks of, you know, like violent hierarchies of values and violent oppositions. I mean, even when he's talking about something like the light and dark, he'll talk about, you know, the violence of that binary, because light is always privileged over darkness, as if this is some sort of nefarious way of conceiving of things, as opposed to thinking, well, maybe we tend to privilege light over darkness because we see in the light. We're diurnal. We're not nocturnal.
Right.
We're subject to more threats when we're in the dark. And there are lots of like experiential reasons that we can all point to and say, well, yeah, there's a reason that darkness tends to have a certain symbolic meaning, and lightness another symbolic meaning, and a lot of times we want to privilege the light over the dark. These are all just associations that I think are not just part of a particular linguistic tradition or history or civilization. It's part of being human. You know, yeah.
So they conceive, both him and the other writers, but also Judith Butler, they conceive of these categories as oppressive, and they are determined not to be subjected to anything. So you go on and even indicate that the mere idea of myth is counterintuitive. It is in diametric opposition to deconstruction, because even myth needs to be subjected to deconstruction. To someone like Derrida. Because even myth was produced, according to them, within a certain cultural realm, certain time of human evolution, etc.
Yeah.
But isn't it interesting that when we read them, we see, but hang on, just listen. Whether they like it or not, they are constellating, they are incarnating a myth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is the myth of eternal youth. You're noticing, you're recognizing in their operation.
Yeah, there's a moment in the introduction, and I come back to it several times throughout the book, but just kind of pointing out the irony. Okay, here's this way of thinking about things that wants to look at myth as just delusional, mistaken. It wants to take apart myth and say that there's no real meaning there, and yet that mentality itself is a mythic one. I mean, that's
Yes.
described in literature.
Yes.
We know that's like a personality type that comes up again and again and again throughout a lot of literature. The person who thinks that they can just throw out the past because they know better and they can move into a future. I mean, it's like, hello? I mean, you're repeating the same patterns that you insist just don't even exist or shouldn't exist,
Yeah.
There's a deep irony there.
There is a deep irony, but I like what you said, whether they like it or not, whether they want to do it or want to accept it or not, the fact is that they are being subjected to mythification. It is what it is. They are an enactment of a superordinate structure, and this specifically, this myth of the eternal youth.
Yeah.
So my question is then, don't we as humans need some sort of mythicization, if you will, for lack of a better word, in order to survive as part of a defense system, defense mechanism? I mean, it serves a purpose, right?
Yeah.
So and so I guess that would be my question is the purpose of it and how that ends up protecting our own psychic integrity and ability to move through the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we need myth, we need story. Jung would argue that we need either religion or something that sure as heck looks like it. Maybe we need to renovate how we think of these things, which is kind of why he came up with the archetypes, and his whole psychology is kind of a way of speaking a religious language in a way that can still make sense and seems reasonable from a modern perspective. But yeah, I mean, we need those stories. And, one of the things that one of the ways that people talk about deconstruction and postmodernism is it's always wanting to undermine this idea of any sort of meta-narrative, any sort of grand story. And from a Jungian perspective, we need that. We need a meta-narrative. We need some way of, and Jung's point would be, it's like, even if you say you don't need it, oh, that just means you're even deeper in one. And I'd rather have you know that you have a meta-narrative, have a sense of what it is, have a sense of where it comes from, understand that maybe other people aren't sharing quite the same meta-narrative, and also knowing that these I'm using meta-narrative and myth almost interchangeably right now.
Yeah.
That these are part of the nature of our being.
We're focusing very much on Derrida and how he actually attacks the paternal in terms of time. You go into detail with your discussion on the eternity of time as well as the divisibility of time, etc., etc. But how about we move to Judith Butler just for a moment or two, and then we can tie it together with Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Now, how about you elaborate a bit on Judith Butler?
So, I think she is a great exemplar of the attitude that I've been trying to delineate, you know, the basic ethos of deconstruction, because she's taken it to such an extreme that it's demonstrably absurd. So, you know, if the deconstructive approach says that there's nothing self-evident, nothing obvious, nothing universal, that
Right.
these are all just questions of, you know, historical precedents and the way other people have thought about things in other periods of time. Well, you know, she takes that and she applies it to something as self-evident as sexual dimorphism, you know.
Yeah.
I think for most of us, hopefully still, it's just self-evident that human beings come in two basic forms.
Sure.
There's female and male, you know,
Sure.
and there are, you know, conditions that make it hard to identify those two types, but they're still there. And that is
Yes.
something that's self-evident. It's obvious. It's a matter of just nature.
Yes.
And Butler comes along and she says, well, no, it's not that self-evident. In fact, the deal is our language and our culture is so intimately entwined with our physical bodies that we can't differentiate the two. We can't say that it's just a given biological fact that there are two sexes, because where language and culture already implicates and confuses things to such an extreme degree that we can't say it's just a given. And so it's really sort of it's like a variation on Derrida's argument insofar as she's kind of messing with the priority that we give things like perception and language. And Derrida tends to just kind of switch the two and say, no, language comes first. First, you learn male, female, and then you learn to perceive it, right? And then Butler, I mean, she's so tricky. She's so difficult to wrap your head around. But she kind of says, well, it's not quite that, but they're just so deeply entwined with one another that we can't really say that there's just this material fact. Sexual dimorphism just is what it is.
Yeah.
So
and
that
is,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, and that is where von Franz comes in, because her conceptualization of the eternal youth is pre-Oedipal. That is in relation to the maternal. And with Butler, in relation to the material body, the biological body, the defiance, defiantly disregarding the reality of the material body, right?
Yeah, I was so amazed and pleased when I started seeing that there's all these deep etymological associations and connections between the idea of mother and the idea of matter.
Yes.
Yes.
I
In
remember that from your
Indo-European
talk.
languages, they run parallel. It's like it's as if there's something there in the idea of matter and mother that goes so deep that it's just part of how human beings perceive things and think about things. And it makes perfect sense to me intuitively. I mean, mother gives us, you know, material nurturance. She is the matter from which we arise, you know. And so if there's an issue with mom, it makes sense to me intuitively, and I think it makes sense etymologically and symbolically, that there's going to be also an issue with matter and the material world and just coming to terms with it.
Right.
And the ambivalent, and you mentioned too, I think, and it was in your talk, the ambivalent relationship with mother.
Yeah, and you can really see this reflected in Butler's her book Bodies That Matter, where she puts forth this really absurdly confused and confusing notion of what she calls materialization, which is this kind of vague process by which it's, you know, matter it seems to come into being in a particular form based on the language that we're using and the culture that we're born in. And but at the same time, it sort of exists before that language, but it doesn't. I mean, it's this all this really equivocal way of talking about matter where you don't know. It's like, okay, she seems to be denying that there's anything called material reality, but then in the next breath saying, but I'm not doing that. And so it's just rife with ambivalence. And I think in a lot of ways that does mirror the ambivalence that on von Franz's reading of the eternal youth often feels towards a mother figure. You know, he wants to escape mom, but then he also wants to kind of suckle at her breast. You know, he wants to be independent and go out into the world, and yet he has these sort of, you know, pre-Oedipal cravings and longings that keep him attached to mom. Kind of sense there's something similar going on with Butler and her thinking. Yeah.
But then we have a grounding myth, a myth that maybe plays out in the writings of Merleau-Ponty. The grounding myth of the god Kairos.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. That was because, you know, I wanted to write a book that wasn't just you know, just being kind of critical of the eternal youth and critical of deconstruction. I kind of wanted to, you know, do that, but then say, well, okay, what is the more healthy, grounded, integral way of looking at a lot of these same questions and themes? And at the mythical level, I came across the figure of Kairos, which is also a youth figure. And then I also read a lot of Merleau-Ponty, the French phenomenologist. What is so fascinating about him and why I love his thinking so much is that he was like a part of two very different intellectual traditions. He was a phenomenologist, so he's basing all of his thinking says you have to go back to perception, phenomena, just things how they appear, how you experience them directly. But then he was also profoundly influenced by the sort of semiotic thinking that influenced Derrida. So he had to grapple with these two disparate intellectual traditions. The one that wants to focus purely on language and culture and says this is primary. And then the other one that says, no, we can actually just set language and culture aside and just see things as they are and then try to express what that is. And he has a really fascinating way of saying both and in a way that I think is very productive because it allows us to say, okay, there's some validity in this attempt to deconstruct things, to reduce things to language and culture. But there's always this counterbalancing force, you know, and so his approach is more of an integral way of thinking. By the same token, this figure of Kairos, I think, is a figure of youth in a youthful attitude in its healthy manifestation, when it's not reflexively in opposition to authority, when it's not in a sort of retrograde way, super attached to mom, and yet also really ambivalent towards mom. So Kairos is sort of this image of a healthy way of having a youthful attitude, living in the present, being open to the new.
Yes.
Yeah.
And isn't the paradox being open to the new in the present while embracing what is there? It's both those aspects of embracing what is there, but also being open to what might come. It is not just deferring. It is not just defiant.
Yeah.
It is the both and, as you say, the combination of the two extremes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
The image that I use to talk about Merleau-Ponty and sort of an image that helps kind of move beyond, I think, a lot of the thinking of Derrida and Butler is the image of the Ouroboros, which is a snake that's eating its tail. Which I think it's kind of like a mandala. It's like an image of wholeness. And it offered me a way of kind of saying, well, what do things look like when they're not split, when they're not dissociated, when we don't have the eternal youth who's in conflict with Father Time, when we don't have the eternal youth that's in conflict with Mother Matter? What does it look like when they're kind of all connected in a way that's not, rife with dissociative dynamics? And an Ouroboros or a circle is perfect for that. Within Jungian psychology, it's just that's how we think of a circle or a mandala, is they're images of wholeness.
Yeah.
But
this is a perennial tendency. It's a perennial tendency that societies, civilizations, humanity need to survive.
Yes. Again, it goes back to the parameters of containment and groundedness that we need to survive. I mean, and I'm just curious, Bret, as you were thinking about this in terms of the big gender kind of stuff that we're right in the middle of, and how this sort of addresses that or deconstructs what the issues are around why we're seeing all of these gender dysphoric issues that are starting to pop up, because it's sort of the epitome of deconstructing, right? That there is no male female even anymore. There is no nature of things.
Right. Let's go back to Peter Pan. Peter Pan, who lives in a place called Neverland. And there's a curious thing about Neverland. In Neverland, it's never really clear what's real and what's imagined. And there's a wonderful scene in Peter Pan where Peter is pretending to eat food, and yet he's literally growing fatter. But the question arises, well, what does that even, I mean, that doesn't make sense. And then if we put on top of that Neverland itself is an imaginary realm, so I'm like, well, this doesn't make any sense. But it seems like there in that place, just to pretend to be something, to pretend to do something, has real life effects. And I could not see a more clear parallel, a literary parallel, with Judith Butler than that, because her thesis can be boiled down to this idea that what you pretend to be is what you are. Your performance, your gender performance creates the gender that you claim to be. And so performance is reality. And there it is. I mean, that's kind of the world we're living in. And I think just about anybody, if you said, I'm thinking these people kind of live in fantasy land or Neverland, will say, oh, yeah, I'm kind of feeling that too, because there's something here that just doesn't add up. I can't pretend to be something and then expect everybody to kind of go along. One last thing that actually happens in the story of Peter Pan.
Yes.
When Peter sees that some of the lost boys, the other, people there in Neverland, aren't going along with what he wants, aren't pretending in the way that he wants them to pretend, he gets furious.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing that same sort of basic personality structure playing itself out, where it's like, if you're not going along with my version of what I believe to be real, it's not just that we have a disagreement. It's like you tap into sometimes some really deep rage, some really deep trauma, dysfunction.
Absolutely.
They viciously want to keep the hypersubjectivity and the hyperimaginary in place.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the ways I think about this is like Neverland is a wonderful place to visit. And it's wonderful to think about imagination and fantasy and even talk about how we perform our genders. That's all great. But you have to make the return trip and ground it back in,
reality.
three-dimensional reality, which in terms of gender means you have to, in order for the term gender to even really continue to be a meaningful concept, you have to return to the idea of sex, biological sex, because that's where it comes from to begin with. You have to, so it's like, it's a round trip.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the round trip involves facing and integrating reality of time, that we do grow old, sexual dimorphism, the differences in sexes, the differences in generations too, by the way, between child and adult. You see, that is another issue.
We don't want to face, but we have to face. And the deconstruction in many ways, in my mind and how I conceptualize it, allows us to escape from reality in a way that we have no more tangible connections to the solid earth and to the ground, because we have indulged in flights of fancy to the extreme. And that's, I think, a very dangerous place, especially for the youth of today to be living in.
Yeah.
And also to resist the seduction of imagining that you're so morally superior to everyone else, because in the myth of Peter Pan, it is little who has to sew his shadow back on his, onto his body, because Peter Pan loses his shadow. I mean, the moral certainty and moral superiority that you sometimes observe in people who are so adamant at condemning those who are connected with reality is astonishing.
And they can't seem to see, they can't even imagine their own capacity for evil. And I think,
well, it's projected onto everyone else.
It's projected onto
they've
everyone
lost all
else.
connection with their shadow. I'm glad you brought that up. People who aren't aware of their own propensity or possibility of violence, evil, destruction. And if you're in a super regressive mentality that refuses to grow up, that refuses to accept limitation, that it refuses to even acknowledge the death as a immediate possibility at any given moment, then you're going to have these really inflated tendencies, gross sense of moral superiority, and be completely oblivious to the harm that you might be causing.
Your own darkness. Absolutely. This is a must read. It's a must read. And again, Bret, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful work.
I really appreciate it. And this has been a great conversation. You both have helped me expand as best I can in this format on some really difficult ideas that I was able to go into in much, much greater depth in a book that addresses two really difficult yet super important, relevant, influential thinkers.
Very relevant.
Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction, an archetypal reading of Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler.
We very strongly recommend everybody pick up a copy.
Thank you so much.